Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the last of our music talks and tea series for this strange online fall semester. I'm Professor Mark Spicer, Deputy Chair of the Music Department. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, David Pearson. Dr. Pearson is a music historian, saxophonist, composer, and educator. He is an adjunct assistant professor in the music department at Lehman College and earned his PhD in musicology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. David is also a proud alumnus of Hunter College, where he completed his Bachelor of Music and earned his MA. As a saxophonist, David has performed modernist and contemporary classical, modal jazz, punk, rap, and more, and currently plays in the Afro-punk band Digital Diaspora. I should mention also that the seed of his talk today on American punk in the 1990s was first sown in his master's thesis completed at Hunter in 2012 under my supervision, which since blossomed into his doctoral dissertation on the subject and now a full-blown book from Oxford University Press. Needless to say, I'm very proud of him. David is one of the world's leading experts on American punk, and what makes his work stand out from the crowd, or should I say the mosh pit, is the way in which he seamlessly blends ethnography with close musical analysis. After his presentation, I will serve as moderator for further questions and discussion. Please type your questions into the chat box on Zoom or the comments section on YouTube, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So a warm Hunter welcome back to David Pearson. Take it away, David.
All right, thanks, Mark, for that nice introduction there. And I'm just going to share a slideshow, and we're going to hear some music today. So definitely brace your ears for that, because it's going to be loud punk music. So by way of introduction, my book documents what's often referred to as the 1990s underground punk renaissance. And the 1990s was a time when punk really revolutionized itself, both politically and musically. So politically, it was dealing with this transition from the Cold War to the New World Order, from having a convenient target of Reagan to target its rebellion against, to having this sort of, liberal multiculturalism of Bill Clinton, which posed some challenges as far as how to actually develop a more sophisticated political critique when you didn't have somebody like Reagan or Trump that kind of personifies everything punk hated. Punk also dealt with its own kind of internal demons of the late 1980s. Namely, during that time period, there was a rise of Nazi skinheads, and there was also the increasing dominance of a kind of white male suburban subjectivity in the punk scene. So what 1990s punk did was both develop this more sophisticated political critique of American society, but also challenge its own internal demons, essentially kicking Nazis out of this scene, and then also foregrounding the subjectivities of people who hadn't really been represented in that way in punk. And then musically alongside that, a number of different subgenres proliferated during the 1990s. And also punk bands explored new ways of basically expressing the kind of political message and the different subjectivities within punk. So obviously that's a big story that encompasses a lot of subplots, and we're not going to talk about the whole thing today. So what I'm going to do today specifically is I'm going to be analyzing one punk song called The Power of Medusa by Anti-Product, which is just one example of the many flowerings of the 1990s punk underground. And besides analyzing the music, I'm also going to draw a lot on my own interview with the lead singer of Anti-Product, Taina Asili. My book itself, like Mark mentioned, really combines ethnography, so interviews with punk musicians, as well as musical analysis, and also what the discourse in punk zines has to say about all these things. I'm just going to focus on that one song today. But before I do that, I want to just introduce, kind of give us all a baseline for punk music and its history. Because part of what I'm aiming to do is kind of dispel the notion that punk is just simple 3-chord rock any amateur can perform. So let's kind of go into a very brief reductive history of punk. So punk started in the late 1970s, mid-late 1970s in London and New York. It had its antecedents in garage and pub rock, as well as acts who did a lot of stage theatrics like Iggy Pop and David Bowie. Now, the 1977 punk explosion really captured the imaginations of youth on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as taking the music industry by storm with its ethos of rebellion. And this was perhaps best exemplified by the band the Sex Pistols attempting to disrupt the Queen's Jubilee by performing loud, abrasive punk music on a boat on the River Thames. So just a couple news articles about the scandal whipped up by the Sex Pistols there. But, you know, besides that singular event, punk really resonated deeply with youth who felt there really was no future for them in the deindustrializing cities of the US and UK. And early punk also really married art student and working class sensibilities into this potent mix. Now, musically, punk bands used the standard rock instrumentation of guitars, bass, drums, and vocalists. But some things they did really simplified rock down to the basics. For example, the guitars generally played power chords. So just a chord of a root, a fifth, and an octave above the root, no third or anything. And of course, heavily distorted those guitar chords. Tempos in punk were, of course, on the fast end of rock, and the vocals were often snarled with little concern for pitch precision or melodic elaboration. So no flowery melodies there. Now, after punk's initial explosion around 1977, the music industry lost much interest in it, and punk became basically an underground cultural phenomenon with a few exceptions. But this underground scene developed a robust network of bands, zines, which are short for fanzines, concert venues, and independent record labels. And then it also started to spread around the globe. Now, in the early 1980s, a new style called hardcore punk emerged. And hardcore punk made punk even faster, louder, and made the vocals even more abrasive. So I just want to play a short example of hardcore punk in the early 80s, namely Minor Threat's song Straight Edge. So here we go. So that's half the song there. You can see it's really short. And there's a few other things that really stand out about hardcore punk music. Number one, the tempo, right? Tempos in hardcore punk generally approach or even exceed 300 beats per minute. And once the tempo is that fast, you no longer hear it as the typical 4 beats of rock with that backbeat, right? And so for that reason, when I analyze punk music, I measure tempo by something I call kick snare drum alternation, just KSA for short, exactly because those tempos get so fast that it changes our feel of meter. But you can also hear that those guitars are distorted, and what they're playing is really something best described as riffs, meaning short, emphatic, melodic statements. And just one last thing to note about hardcore in the hardcore punk in the 80s US is it tended to shift the dominant kind of subjectivity and representations of punk to the suburbs and to a more white male subjectivity, which of course would be challenged in the 1990s. So that's just a reductive history of punk just to get us all on the same page. But now let's dig into the song I chose for today. Anti-Products, the power of Medusa. And This song that I'm going to be analyzing deals with the experiences of the band's singer, who is a young Puerto Rican, and it deals with the ways she was confronting American beauty standards as a teenager and young woman. It's also a good example of how women and Latinos actually played more and more of an assertive role in 1990s punks, carved out more of a presence for themselves, and also how feminist analysis increasingly informed some strands of punk. So the band Anti-Product formed in 1995 in upstate New York, and they played a subgenre of punk that's called crust punk. And crust punk was a very propagandistic style, replete with political slogans in the lyrics, and it was often associated with anarchist ideology. And crust punk songs tended to really analyze and express outrage at global injustices, but didn't tend to deal with how these injustices felt personally, didn't kind of speak from that position. And just to get a little feel for crust punk, I'm gonna play the first song from Anti-Product's first 7-inch record. This is a song called Dead Heroes, Dead Dreams. And that's the cover of that first 7-inch record that we're looking at. So here's the song Dead Heroes, Dead Dreams.
There's a difference between a hero and someone you look up to.
Slavery with life made it all. You're a fucking number, not a person with a name. We're beating up and violent and manipulating brain. Dead heroes. Tax rate. Terrorism taking blood for a sale. Dead heroes. Tax rate. Terrorism taking blood. No. The overloaded trailer if you do this from the sound. Get a fucking battle like a fucking fucking blood. The trouble mindset is in a So that's Anti-Product's early music, what it sounds like. It's very typical crust punk, very perfect for this kind of propagandistic music, to put out these slogans really dealing with the injustices of global capitalism. But as time went on, Taina Asili, the main singer in Anti-Product, who you only heard a little bit of in that song, she had joined the band in a teenager, but as she matured intellectually and politically, Asili started to transform Anti-Product's music by incorporating cultural, artistic, and musical influences from outside of punk, and by writing songs that married the band's crust punk politics with her own personal experiences and feelings of rage as a young Puerto Rican woman. And after moving to Philadelphia, Asili became increasingly involved in the spoken word poetry scene there, in particular taking inspiration from Black women poets like Jill Scott, Ursula Rucker, and Sonia Sanchez. And she also became involved in the underground hip hop scene, and occasionally performed alongside the rap duo Dead Prez. And between these expressions and her involvement in the political movement to free former Black Panther, death row inmate, and political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, Asili increasingly asserted radical Black and Puerto Rican political and cultural expressions into her punk band's creative output. So basically transformed the politics and the music of her band by drawing on these other inspirations. And Asili described to me her growing awareness of the conflict between her Puerto Rican identity and culture on the one hand, and the broader punk scene on the other. So here's Asili's words, quote, "Performing at ABC No Rio, a punk venue in New York's Lower East Side, was interesting for me because my mother was born and raised in the Lower East Side, and my grandmother still lived there. At the time, it was a predominantly Latino community, particularly a lot of Puerto Ricans. I'm Puerto Rican, so I would have this connection to the Lower East Side, and yet ABC No Rio, with the exception of the band Huasipungo, felt like a very white space. And the punk scene in general on the East Coast seemed to be a very white space. And there seemed to be this obvious disconnection of the greater community from ABC No Rio. That was difficult for me. I felt like part of this Puerto Rican community in one way and part of this punk community in another way. And that's sort of a theme for the rest of my life in the punk scene, feeling like I had to separate my punk self from my Latina self. End quote. So that's Cecily's way of describing this conflict, which increasingly also found its way into Anti-Products music. So she describes that as she confronted this conflict, it took on a musical dimension. And here's what she had to say. Quote, "My parents are Puerto Rican and are also musicians and dancers. So Puerto Rican music was integral to my childhood, an integral part of my musical passion that I also felt like I had to disconnect from. Also singing. I'm actually a really good singer, but I had to scream sing in Anti-Product. Percussion was important to me. I was into hip hop. I wanted to incorporate some other hip hop rhythms into Anti-Products music. My father was a conguero. I had a djembe and I wanted to incorporate the djembe into it. My band was really resistant," end quote. So that's how this conflict over identity and culture and what was kind of acceptable within US punk played out in the musical dimension within Asili's own band. However, Asili's djembe playing and her spoken word poetry, as well as rhythms outside of the usual kick and snare drum blare of punk, did find their way onto several songs on Anti-Products' 1999, The Deafening Silence of Grinding Gears LP. And there's the cover of that. The music on this LP also incorporated greater complexity and varying musical moods than prior recordings by the band, in large part because Cecily's lyrics, this spoken word poetry sense to them really required it. This is how she described it, how she described what went into Anti-Products' last LP. Quote, "We have a song called Modern Day F Word, which is sort of this poem over music. I remember the band being like, what is this? This isn't punk. And I was really into spoken word at that time, and I really wanted to pull that into our music. And it ended up being one of the most popular songs that we ever wrote. Me taking up more space as a woman and talking about feminism in a more concrete way, and in a way that was more personal to me, to my experience, was challenging for the band. They didn't quite understand it. Eventually they would support it once they saw that it was well received. I think maybe they were scared of how it would be perceived by our audience. What ended up happening was many women started following our music more, and many people of color started following our music more. And my band would see how meaningful that was to them, so they would support it moving forward," end quote. So you can see how she's asserted this kind of new dynamic into her own band and into its music. Aside from this song, Modern Day F Word, that Asili mentions, the song The Power of Medusa is another example of Asili's spoken word style lyrics in a punk song. The Power of Medusa expressed her own personal experience as a young Puerto Rican woman, confronting the constant barrage of body images of white women with starvation-thin bodies that you get all over the place in the US that did not look like her own, as you can see from the lyrics. And the lyrics and musical structure of this song go through a process of moving from despair to rage to empowerment. And I'll discuss this musical process in depth, but first let's familiarize ourselves with this song by listening to it in full while following along with this song outline I've created that breaks down the strong structure both by lyrics, but also by vocal delivery and by what the band's playing. So here we go.
Pages of a magazine, a first game.
So now that we've gotten an overview of the dramatic arc, which the lyrics and music follow, let's dig into each section of this song and look at really how it expresses this narrative from despair to rage to empowerment. So starting with the intro, the Power of Medusa begins with a really desolate sounding introduction in A minor, in which the guitars, in single notes rather than the typical power chords of punk, and bass alternate their singular attack on the tonic, with a fifth added by the right guitar after the first iteration. Semitone motion from the minor third to the second scale degree and back, which you can see in the second bar of that transcription, really sets up this mood of despair. And the lack of a solid drum beat in this introduction and little rhythmic density from the guitars and bass provide Celia with a spacious sonic atmosphere over which to begin her spoken word. As the song's introduction increases in intensity with heavier accents from the drums, Celia's searching vocals reach towards desperation by switching to a yelled vocal delivery in a higher vocal range, at which point the drums enter. So let's hear that introduction. So that's how the song's set up. Now let's turn to the A minor music that follows this introduction. Although the tempo of the Power of Medusa, hovering around 150 beats per minute, is far slower than a typical punk song, especially a hardcore punk song, when the drums enter underneath Celia's yelling, intensity and forward momentum manifest by way of the syncopated snare drum hits before and after beat 3. The move from open hi-hat before and during beat 1 to a closed hi-hat thereafter makes beat 2 a powerful point of arrival and further intensifies the feeling of forward momentum. While the active bass line and palm-muted right guitar track match the rhythmic intensity of the drums, the left guitar track seems to sonically match the anguished despair of the vocals by virtue of playing single notes that ring out often for an entire bar. The left guitar track outlines an A minor triad as well as the semitone motion between the third and second scale degree that we heard in the intro. The combination of forward momentum by drums, bass, and right guitar on the one hand, and a held out cry by the left guitar provides the perfect backdrop for Celia to intensify her voice from yelling to a scream as she confronts media images of idealized white beauty and compares them to her own body. Celia's final scream in this section on the word scream is answered by the left guitar track moving to the same rhythm as the other instruments, the bass moving up an octave, and the band playing rhythmically tighter and slightly faster. In other words, a new kind of intensity. So let's hear that this section after the introduction. Now, the apex of despair in the lyrics at which Celia announces the self-hatred provoked by her look in the mirror, however, demands that this forward momentum and rhythmic intensity be brought to a halt for the frustrated scream that delivers the proclamation, "And so I hate." At this moment, the drums and guitars drop out, leaving only the bass, now back down an octave, to accompany Celia's moment of frustration. And here we have an example of a structural element common to hardcore punk songs, namely the breakdown. And the breakdown in punk is where the tempo is slowed down. Often some instruments drop out
and the intensity is reduced or modified so that it can be brought back up again later with the re-entry of the full band and return to the previous tempo. So in this case, in this song, this breakdown section is used to really amplify the emotional breakdown that's occurring in the lyrics and in the vocal delivery. So let's hear the breakdown on The Power of Medusa. Now, when the full band returns with the previous A minor music following this breakdown, Asili uses this renewal of intensity to enumerate the ways in which socialization to live up to white supermodel beauty standards provokes self-hatred of her Puerto Rican female body. Here, she seems to trip over her own rapid vocal delivery in frustrated exasperation. But just as the song reaches its moment of greatest despair, an epiphany occurs in both lyrics and music. Namely, Asili's declaration that, quote, their standards can't hold my weight, end quote, rendered audible and all the more powerful by the departure of the guitars and bass from the musical texture. So let's hear that music after the breakdown. Now, following this moment of epiphany that offers the first move away from despair and turns the rage into a confrontation with patriarchy and white supremacy, we are treated to a rare occurrence in punk, namely a key change, in this case from minor to major. And in this next section, while the tonic A remains emphasized as the opening note of the bass and guitar riffs in this new section, the composite of these two melodies seems to center on the pitch F, a pitch that we have not heard in the song up to this point, affecting a shift to F Lydian, a major mode. Whereas the A minor had shrouded the first almost 2 minutes of this song in desolation and anguish, the song's overall tonic A suddenly becomes a bright beacon revealing the road forward when it is ensconced in a major mode. When Asili enters over this major mode foundation, the lyrics indicate that she has fallen not into a pit of despair, but into a revelation of a million hidden bodies that can't be shown in the glossy magazines and on the TV screens. So let's hear what it sounds like when a punk song changes key from minor to major. Oops, sorry. Now, the final section of The Power of Medusa, taking up less than a third of the song, returns to A minor, but gone is the anguished single note cry of the left guitar track, and instead both guitars emulate the bass line without any palm muting. Combined with the thunderous rumbling of 16th notes on the kick drum via double bass drum pedal, intense attacks on the snare drum with little syncopation, a hi-hat now kept open, so much more splashy, and crashes on the cymbals and more active bass fills, this A minor material becomes not despair, but defiance. In the lyrics of this final section, Asili's body parts and sense of self become not sources of shame, but pillars of power buttressed by the spirits of the forgotten women. She is thus able to confront the forces of patriarchy head on and win, as the lyrics say, because now they know that at any moment I could take one look at them and turn them all to stone. This final statement of empowerment is, like the first moment of confrontation, rendered all the more audible by virtue of the guitars and bass dropping out and the drummer returning to the original drum beat with its syncopated snare hits. What makes this process of moving from anguish to empowerment all the more riveting is the visceral level on which Asili's voice reaches out to us and bears her soul through a mixture of vulnerable or declarative spoken word, anguished or determined yells, and screams that seem to possess the very power of Medusa to turn sources of the male gaze into stone. So let's now hear this final section of The Power of Medusa. Now, the expressive power of this song, The Power of Medusa, comes from a perfect combination of deeply personal and politically penetrating lyrics, Asili's delivery of those lyrics in a way that seems to come from the depths of her soul, and a song structure that flows out of and intensifies the poetic form and dramatic momentum of the lyrics. Whereas much punk politics is expressed in songs through the us versus them mentality of punk, The Power of Medusa takes a different approach. The conflicts it addresses take place not just on the terrain of oppressed versus oppressor, but also in the realm of inner struggle. This song thus brings to life a complex mix of emotions, ranging from vulnerability to determination not found in most male punk. The Power of Medusa stands as a palpable indication of what could occur when women were able to bring their agency into the rage and politics of punk and stretch the boundaries of the punk rebellion to include their own personal experiences, and perhaps more importantly, the empowerment that comes from defying a society that instructs women in the proper ways to look, think, and act. On that note, and as a fitting conclusion to this talk, here's what Asili had to say about how punk allowed her as a teenager to reclaim her body. Quote, "I was a young girl of color coming into my own from a really small town in upstate New York in a predominantly white community. The punk scene was a way for me to reclaim my body because outside of the punk scene, I was constantly told that I wasn't beautiful, that I wasn't worthy of love and belonging in my own brown woman body. Here was a scene where it was still predominantly white, but it was at least saying all of our bodies are beautiful, and if you don't like it." Now, getting into punk started out as a very rebellious reclamation of my body. If you don't like my brown skin, how about if my hair was purple? If you don't like the way I'm dressing, how about I rip up my stockings and put studs on my jacket? There was this sort of superficial reclamation that eventually went a lot deeper for me. This was my beginning introduction to feminist politics. In my undergrad years, I ended up studying women's studies, end quote. Now, between these words of Asili, this very personal story of her own transformation, but also looking at the musical narrative from despair to rage empowerment in the song The Power of Medusa, we really get a sense of punk music's ability to move people emotionally and politically, above all viscerally, into a potent rebellious force within the belly of the beast. And that's really what I think most punk songs come down to. And this one expresses it in this kind of beautifully unique way, dealing with issues that punk not necessarily had dealt with much prior to the 1990s. So thanks for your time, and look forward to your questions and comments on all this.
Thank you very much, David, for your fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And I don't see any questions in the chat, but actually I do now see one, and this is coming from Professor Jeffrey Burleson. So let me ask his question for you. It says, Hey, David, thanks for such a vital and compelling presentation, and mega congrats on the book. I wasn't familiar with Anti-Product and really enjoyed the analysis, so thanks for introducing me to them as well. Question, do you think non-white crust punk bands received any influence or inspiration from earlier Afro-punk bands like Bad Brains?
Yeah, good question. So I think the Bad Brains, which was an all-black hardcore band from Washington, D.C., that really paved the way. They were really one of the harbingers of hardcore punk style. They were definitely a strong reference point in punk through the 90s down to today. So they were certainly a musical inspiration for all crust punk bands. And I think having a sort of precedent as far as non-white punk bands certainly would have bolstered other Latino, Asian, and Black members of punk bands. I would also say, though, that crust punk as a subgenre had sort of its own development. That's a long story that I won't get all into, but it had a lot to do with English bands in the early 1980s, like Discharge, setting this precedent for the musical style. And then US bands like Nausea, which was actually in New York and fronted by and had a woman singer, set this kind of precedent. And crust punk bands, I think most of them were white. You know, there were a few non-whites in crust punk bands, but most of the members were white. But crust punk bands there were a lot of them with women singers. So that was another way that the crust punk style changed the dynamics of punk. But I think just the last thing I'll say on this is there was this early precedent with Bad Brains, and late 70s punk tended to be a lot more diverse. There was kind of a separation of that from the late 80s to the early 90s, where in the late 80s, that kind of diversity, it's not that it went away, but that it was much harder for members of punk bands who weren't white or who were women or who were gay to actually find a space for representation. So there was also kind of that period of punk where that sort of went away. So yeah, but thanks. Good question.
Great, thanks. So do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any more in the chat. I'm waiting for questions to possibly be fed to me from YouTube, but they're not. So, okay, so Professor Burleson has another question. He says, I've been a big fan of the band At the Drive-In for a long time, which is an all-Latino punk group. Are you familiar with them? And if so, where would you place them with regards to subgenre and culture?
Ooh, good question. I'm familiar with At the Drive-In, but I wouldn't claim to have sort of an analysis of all their music and the meaning of it. But what I would say is that the 1990s, another dynamic that took place was the rise of alternative, right? With Nirvana being the big breakout of that. And then this whole crop of grunge bands following. And those bands were definitely inspired by punk, but I think musically they were doing something a little different than what kind of the punk scene proper was doing. And I'm not saying that to invalidate what they're doing or as a judgment. Just more saying that the music started to branch out in these different directions. So to me, At the Drive-In is a band that certainly drew on punk, but also drew on a lot of other developments, including indie rock and a lot more experimentation. So kind of branched out in that way. The other dynamic at work in the 1990s was that on the one hand, you had this underground punk scene that wasn't interested in mainstream success, wasn't on major record labels, and wasn't even in chain record stores. And then you had bands who made it into the mainstream or who were somewhere in between the mainstream and the underground. And there actually it became a greater separation between the two in the mid-90s, with the underground punk scene kind of rejecting any kind of association with the mainstream. And then the bands that did achieve mainstream or half mainstream success, like At the Drive-In, kind of going a different way. So there's also this separation that goes on in that way with punk and alternative music in the 90s.
Yeah, great. Along those same lines, I would say that would you agree that the aesthetic of punk always has had something to do with rejecting the notion of mainstream success, or when a band gets too big, then they have to stop? I mean, I'm thinking famously of Johnny Lydon of the Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, saying that the Sex Pistols just got too big, and they lasted for barely a couple of years, and then they just famously just imploded after that American tour in early 1978. Do you think that that's true in general about punk rock? In other words, it's a genre that more comfortably exists in the underground, and once bands like Nirvana become mainstream, they're kind of no longer punk anymore. It's kind of part of the identity of punk is this undergroundness.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, number one, once a band enters into the world of the mainstream music industry, there's a whole new set of challenges and contradictions, right? And, it's a different animal to handle. I think part of what happened with punk is that while you had some mainstream interest in punk in the late 70s, around 1977, after that, the mainstream music industry kind of lost interest in punk. And there are a few bands that, like The Clash, that were still came from punk, that were more mainstream. But the punk scene responded to that by developing this whole DIY network, right, of record labels, of venues, et cetera, that were independent of the music industry. What's fascinating about the 90s is then the music industry suddenly gets interested in punk again, first with Nirvana, and then with Green Day, when the pop punk of Green Day goes mainstream in 1994.
Yes.
And what's in chapter 5 of my book is actually about essentially the debate that erupted, where a lot of people in the punk scene said, no, if you sign to a major label, if you're too popular, you're not punk anymore, get out of our scene, right? So there was one segment that really excised these bands from punk. There were other people, though, who thought, I'm not going to go that far. I see the merits of that. And then there were some bands who basically were kind of somewhere between independent and mainstream. And those were SoCal punk bands like NoFX and Bad Religion and Pennywise. So how people interpret, can you be punk and be in the mainstream? It depends who you ask, but there's definitely a big segment in the underground punk scene who says, no, once you sign to a major label, that's it, you're out of punk.
Yeah. Thanks for that answer. I do have another question here. And this is from another of our distinguished Hunter alumnus. This is alumni. This is from Brian Terry, who says, hi, David. Really excellent presentation and congratulations on the book. I'm particularly interested in the incorporation of influences outside of punk into the style. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit more from a broader perspective on the genre. For instance, as external influences were incorporated, were there patterns of the displacement of more traditional punk musical elements, like, for instance, the slow tempo in Power of Medusa?
Yeah, great question. So punk, of course, has always had relations with other genres, especially reggae in its beginnings. Reggae and punk had this kind of mutual relationship, especially in London.
I think in the 90s, and especially I think after 2000, there have been more and more incorporations of other styles. In the 90s, there was also a flourishing ska punk scene, of course. But I think this has also been something that's always been controversial within punk. And the question sort of becomes, as you incorporate more of these influences from outside of punk, as the tempos to your songs slow down, as you stop playing power chords and start playing lead guitar parts, are you still punk, right? So a good example of that would be Fugazi in the late 80s and early 90s, which was founded by the singer of Minor Threat, paradigm of hardcore punk. But then Fugazi incorporates funk and reggae, and they have lead guitar parts, and they're singing melodies and playing lead guitar parts. So often what happens is the further a band departs from punk, the more they go in a different direction, have a different audience, even if they're still an underground band. So there really is a sense of a punk scene, but sometimes bands who aren't in punk style are accepted into that too. So I think it's contradictory, and it sort of depends how people respond to it. But I think, like you said, your question suggests, all styles are malleable, all styles change over time, and punk goes off in these all kinds of different directions. And one way it does that is by fusing with other styles.
I have another question now from our music department chair, Suzanne Farron. She says, David, thank you for this wonderful research. The feminist writing that you shared with us strikes me as especially honest. Are there spaces in contemporary popular music that continue in this spirit?
Ooh, good question. And I think, so the quotes were all from an interview I did with Taina Seeley, and interviews I find are very good for kind of getting people to really speak from the heart and whatnot. And I really value Taina Seeley for, kind of bearing the emotions of what she says too. As far as contemporary music, that's a good question. I think maybe one good example would be the rapper No Name, who's a female rapper from Chicago. I think there's a way that she's very political, right? She has this strong radical political message, but then she also talks a lot about, personal contradictions and emotional dilemmas and whatnot, and kind of bears everything that's going on in her music and in her persona. So I think that sort of honesty and even vulnerability is something that's really valuable. It's also can be very uncomfortable for an artist to do. And I think one of the things that Taina Seeley had to deal with in the punk scene was that as she asserted this more feminist presence, and as she asserted Puerto Rican identity and culture, she actually got a backlash. And, some in the punk scene would criticize this or not be interested in it shows. So I think that's one of the dilemmas, but it's a good reason to value artists like Taina Seeley or like No Name today, who really bring that to their music. Yeah.
That's great. Are there any other questions? I don't think so. But you've left so many things for us to think about and ponder about this fascinating music. Punk often gets short shrift, and like you said, there's so much more to it in terms of just simple 3-chord aggressive rock. If you really get behind the message in the lyrics, and this particular band, Anti-Product, is just one example of that, where really just a fascinating kind of niche within that. So I think we're approaching 3:00, and I just would like to thank David again very much for sharing with us his research. Please check out his book. That would be a fascinating stocking stuffer for you to request from as something to read over this cold winter. And to everybody else out there, all our Hunter community, all our students, good luck in your final exams. This has been a strange and difficult semester, but we're all in this together. And we'll see you all again online in the spring semester. And thank you again to David.
And thanks, Hunter Music Department, for having me and organizing this and doing these great programs while we're all in COVID lockdown. So,
yeah. Okay. So with that, I'll say goodbye.